Heavenly Stories.
The sun hung low in the sky as the disciples returned, dusty and tired, their voices carrying both excitement and exhaustion. They had just come back from traveling through villages, preaching, healing, and driving out unclean spirits, doing the very things their teacher had sent them out to do. Their hearts raced with stories of miracles, but their bodies begged for rest. Jesus, watching them, knew their weariness. He could see it in the way Peter's shoulders slumped, in the way John's eyes drooped, and in how the younger one stumbled along behind the group. They needed a break. They needed a moment of quiet away from the endless crowds pressing in, demanding miracles, demanding answers, demanding him. "Come with me," Jesus said gently, his voice carrying both authority and compassion. "Let us go to a quiet place and rest a while." The disciples looked at each other with relief. A quiet place. Rest. Just the thought of being away from the noise, away from the pressure of the crowds, filled their tired souls with hope. They climbed into the boat together, the waves rocking beneath them, and pushed off toward the wilderness across the Sea of Galilee. For a moment, it felt like freedom. The wind brushed against their faces, carrying the scent of water and distant hills. Their conversations grew softer, and some even closed their eyes, imagining the peace that waited for them on the other side. But peace, it seemed, was not meant for that day. As they sailed, people noticed where they were going. Families in the villages, farmers in the fields, mothers holding children on their hips, they all recognized Jesus and his followers. Word spread like fire in dry grass. "He's going across the lake," they shouted. "Hurry! Bring everyone!" Soon, crowds began to gather on foot. They ran along the shoreline, young and old, carrying the sick, the weak, and the desperate. They didn't care how far they had to go. Hope drove their feet forward. If they could just reach him, if they could just touch his presence, maybe everything would change. By the time the boat reached the shore, thousands were already waiting. Men, women, children. The sick and the healthy. The broken and the curious. The disciples' hearts sank. So much for rest. But Jesus, he didn't see them as a burden. He looked at them, and his heart was stirred with compassion. To him, they were like sheep without a shepherd, wandering, hungry, lost. Instead of sending them away, he welcomed them. He spoke words of life, teaching them about the kingdom of God, giving them hope that stretched beyond sickness, beyond poverty, beyond the heavy chains of life. Hour after hour passed. The disciples shifted uncomfortably. The crowd kept growing, the day kept fading, and still Jesus taught. Some listened with wide eyes, hanging on every word. Others clutched their children tightly, praying for a miracle. No one wanted to leave. But hunger has a way of making itself heard. Stomachs growled, children whimpered, and the disciples began to whisper among themselves. "This can't go on," one muttered. "It's getting late." "They have nothing to eat," another said. "Rabbi, send them away," they urged Jesus finally. "Tell them to go into the nearby villages and farms to buy themselves something to eat." The crowd was restless, shifting, tired, and hungry. The disciples' solution was simple: end the day, dismiss the people, let them figure out their own needs. But Jesus, as always, saw things differently. He turned to them with eyes that carried both challenge and mystery. "You give them something to eat," he said. The disciples froze. Had they heard him right? Us? Give them something to eat? There were thousands of people out there. 5,000 men, not counting women and children. Feeding them would take more money than they had ever seen. It was impossible. Or so they thought. The stage was set for a miracle, one that would not only feed empty stomachs but would also open eyes to the limitless provision of God. The disciples stood frozen, staring at their teacher. His words echoed in their minds, impossible and unreasonable, "You give them something to eat." Philip was the first to speak, his voice almost a whisper, yet filled with frustration. "Master, even if we had half a year's wages, it wouldn't be enough to buy bread for everyone here. Look at them. There are thousands." He stretched his hand toward the endless crowd, families sitting in clusters, children tugging at their parents' robes, old men leaning on staffs, women cradling babies. Andrew, ever practical, scanned the crowd. Maybe Jesus meant something different. Maybe there was a hidden lesson in his words. Still, Andrew couldn't help but search. That's when he noticed a young boy, clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The boy's eyes were wide, full of curiosity, but in his hands was something that, in Andrew's mind, was almost laughable: 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. He brought the boy forward, shaking his head as he looked back at the other disciples. "Here is a boy with 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish," Andrew said, his tone uncertain, almost embarrassed. Then he sighed. "But what is that, for so many?" The others scoffed. "A meal fit for a single family, maybe 2. But for thousands?" It was absurd. The boy, however, stood quietly, clutching his little gift. To him, it was all he had, but he was willing to offer it. Somehow, in his childlike faith, he believed Jesus could do something with it. Jesus looked at the loaves and fish, then at the boy, and finally at his disciples. His expression was calm, almost serene, yet his eyes burned with the certainty of heaven. "Bring them to me," he said. The disciples hesitated. This wasn't a plan, it was madness. But they obeyed, handing over the tiny meal. The bread was rough, the kind of cheap barley bread common among the poor. The fish were small, dried, salty, nothing like the rich catches sold in the city markets. And yet, Jesus took them as if they were a king's feast. Then he turned to his disciples again. "Have the people sit down in groups," he instructed. The command seemed simple, but the work was overwhelming. Organizing thousands of people into neat groups of 50s and 100s was no small task. The disciples spread out, waving their arms, calling out instructions, trying to bring order to the chaos. The crowd stirred, murmured, and slowly obeyed. Groups began forming across the green hillside, patches of people sitting down in expectation, their faces lifted toward the man who had healed their sick and spoken words that stirred their souls. The disciples worked until sweat dripped down their foreheads. Peter argued with a stubborn group that refused to move closer together. Thomas sighed loudly, muttering about how ridiculous this all was. Matthew, the former tax collector, tried to calculate the sheer number of people sitting on the grass. It had to be over 5,000 men, not counting women and children. The size of it all pressed on him like a weight. When at last the crowd settled, a hush fell. Thousands of eyes were fixed on one man standing in the center, holding 5 loaves and 2 fish in his hands. The disciples exchanged nervous glances. This was it. Was Jesus really going to try to feed everyone with that? The boy who had offered his food watched from the front, his small chest rising and falling quickly with excitement. His gift was in the master's hands now. Whatever happened, it was no longer his, it belonged to Jesus. Jesus lifted his eyes toward heaven, and the silence deepened. He spoke words of blessing, words that seemed to carry across the hillside and sink into every waiting heart. His voice was steady, filled with gratitude, not desperation. He gave thanks for what he had, not for what was missing, but for what was already in his hands. The disciples leaned in, watching closely. Nothing had changed. The bread and fish looked the same. No multiplication, no miracle, at least, not yet. Jesus broke the loaves into pieces, placing them into the disciples' hands. Then he broke more, and more, and more. The fragments never seemed to end. Something impossible was happening, something their eyes struggled to understand. The disciples looked down at their arms, now filled with bread. Each time they returned to Jesus, there was more. The small bundle of loaves and fish had become an unending supply. The impossible was unfolding right before them. And now, it was time to give it away. The disciples moved cautiously at first, carrying the baskets filled with bread and fish. Each man clutched his portion tightly, glancing down as if afraid the food might vanish before their eyes. The crowd leaned forward, curiosity burning in their faces. Children pointed, mothers whispered, fathers watched intently. Peter stopped at the first group, a cluster of families seated on the grass. He broke off a piece of bread, handing it to a father who quickly passed it to his children. Then another, and another. But when Peter looked back into his hands, the bread hadn't diminished. In fact, it seemed endless. His eyes widened. His heart pounded. He gave more. And more. And still, the bread remained. Across the hillside, John experienced the same. He handed out fish to a line of eager hands, expecting his supply to run dry, yet every time he reached in, there was more waiting. Andrew, who had first brought the boys' offering, felt tears sting his eyes. This was impossible, and yet it was real. The small had become great. The little had become more than enough. A murmur spread through the crowd, no, not a murmur, but a rising wave of wonder. People gasped, pointing, calling out to one another. Look! He's feeding everyone. There's more bread. The fish, there's enough for us all. Mothers pressed food into their children's hands, watching their eyes light up. The elderly chewed slowly, tears streaming down their faces as they tasted a meal they hadn't expected to receive. The hungry, the poor, the broken, they all ate, and ate, and ate. No one was turned away. No one went without. And through it all, Jesus stood at the center, calm and steady, breaking bread, blessing, providing. His face reflected the heart of his Father, generous, abundant, overflowing with compassion. This was no trick, no illusion. It was the power of heaven breaking into earth, showing once again that with God, scarcity could never overshadow his abundance. The disciples, running back and forth, grew bolder with each trip. They no longer feared running out. Instead, they marveled at the supply, laughing in disbelief, shouting to each other across the field. There's still more. Come and take some. Look at this. The boy who had given his meal watched in amazement as his 5 loaves and 2 fish transformed into a banquet for thousands. His heart swelled with joy. He had given little, but in the hands of Jesus, it had become more than he could ever imagine. And still, the miracle continued. The hillside, once restless with hunger, was now alive with joy. Children ran with pieces of bread in their hands, laughing as they filled their bellies. Families huddled close, eating together under the fading sun. The poor, who had come with nothing, now had more than enough. The hopeless, who had arrived weary, now found satisfaction not only for their stomachs but for their souls. By the time the meal was done, something remarkable had happened. Every single person was satisfied. Not just fed, satisfied. 5,000 men, plus women and children, had eaten their fill. And still, the disciples looked around and realized something even greater: there was food left over. Abundance where there had once been scarcity. Overflow where there had once been lack. Provision that defied all logic and reason. The miracle wasn't just about bread and fish. It was a picture of God's heart, his desire to provide, to give more than enough, to satisfy not only hunger but the deepest needs of his people. And as the last rays of sunlight stretched across the hillside, the crowd buzzed with awe. They had seen something unforgettable, something that whispered of heaven itself. But for the disciples, the lesson was only beginning. As the last bites were taken and the crowd leaned back, full and content, a deep sense of wonder lingered in the air. The hillside that had once echoed with groans of hunger now buzzed with satisfied laughter. Children lay sprawled on the grass, crumbs on their cheeks. Fathers clapped each other on the shoulders, marveling at the meal. Mothers rocked their little ones, grateful that, for once, their children's bellies were filled. The disciples, still catching their breath, looked around in disbelief. Not a single person had gone hungry. Every man, woman, and child had eaten until they could eat no more. What had begun with 5 loaves and 2 fish had ended in a feast for thousands. Then Jesus, ever practical and never wasteful, spoke again, "Gather up the leftovers, so that nothing may be lost." The disciples blinked at him. Leftovers? How could there be leftovers when the meal had started with so little? But they obeyed, moving across the hillside with baskets in their arms. As they collected, their amazement only grew. Bread filled the baskets, piece after piece, more than they could have imagined. Fish, too, chunks left uneaten, yet fresh as if newly prepared. People handed them what they could not finish, smiling in gratitude, shaking their heads in disbelief. By the time the disciples finished, they stood in a circle before Jesus, each man holding a basket. Not one was empty. 12 baskets in total. One for every disciple. One for every man who had doubted. One for every heart that had whispered, "It's impossible." Peter lifted his basket, staring down at the overflowing bread. This was nothing but a boy's lunch," he muttered, his voice thick with awe. And now, his words trailed off, swallowed by the enormity of what had happened. John looked at his teacher, his young face glowing with realization. "It's more than a miracle of food," he said softly. "It's a sign. A sign of who you are." The others nodded slowly, their eyes fixed on Jesus. They had witnessed his power before, healing the sick, calming storms, casting out demons, but this was different. This was about provision, about God's ability to take the smallest offering and make it overflow. The boy, now sitting quietly at the edge of the crowd, watched the disciples carry 12 full baskets back to Jesus. His eyes sparkled. In his heart, he knew something greater than himself had taken place. What he had offered was small, but in the hands of the Messiah, it had become enough for thousands. The people, too, began to murmur among themselves. Whispers of wonder passed through the groups. Could this be the prophet we've been waiting for? Surely he is the one sent from God. No ordinary man could do this. The hillside seemed to thrum with expectation. Something was happening, something bigger than bread, bigger than fish, bigger than full stomachs. This was about heaven breaking into earth, about God showing his people that his provision knew no limits. And yet, beneath the joy, there was also tension. Some in the crowd began to whisper not only of prophets but of kings. A man who could feed thousands with nothing, surely he could overthrow Rome. Surely he could lead them to freedom. The disciples caught fragments of the conversations and exchanged uneasy glances. They knew what the people wanted. But they also knew their teacher's kingdom was not of this world. For now, though, the baskets stood as undeniable proof. 12 men, each holding abundance where there had once been scarcity. A miracle not just seen but carried in their own hands. Jesus looked at them, his eyes steady, filled with both love and challenge. He had shown them that God's provision was greater than their doubts. But he also knew, they still had much to learn. The miracle of the loaves and fish was not only about feeding the hungry. It was a lesson about trust, about surrender, about believing that even the smallest gift, when placed in God's hands, could change everything. And as the crowd buzzed with excitement, Jesus quietly slipped away, knowing they wanted to make him king by force. His mission was not to wear a crown of gold, but one of thorns. Not to fill stomachs for a day, but to satisfy souls for eternity. The disciples, still holding their baskets, could only watch as their teacher moved away, carrying with him the mystery of heaven on earth. The hillside still echoed with the joy of the miracle. People were smiling, laughing, and speaking with an excitement that rolled like thunder across the fields. Thousands had eaten. Thousands had been satisfied. And now, thousands were asking the same question, who is this man? Whispers swirled. This must be the prophet Moses spoke about. He is the Messiah, we've been waiting for him. Others were louder, bolder. If he can feed us with nothing, imagine what else he could do. Imagine if he were our king. The idea spread quickly. Hope turned to passion. Men began to rise to their feet, fists clenched in determination. They had lived too long under Rome's shadow, too long in hunger and oppression. But here was a man who could provide without limit, who could heal their sick, who could stir their hearts like no other. He could lead us. He could deliver us. He could be the king we've dreamed of. The disciples heard the murmurs, felt the energy crackle in the air. They glanced at each other nervously. This was dangerous. The crowd's enthusiasm was shifting from gratitude to revolution. Peter leaned toward John, his voice urgent. They're going to try to force him into it. They'll crown him here, today. John's face tightened. But his kingdom isn't like that. They don't understand. Indeed, they didn't. The people were hungry for freedom, but their vision of freedom was too small. They wanted a political king, a warrior ruler, someone who could break the chains of Rome. But Jesus had come to break a far greater chain, the bondage of sin and death. Sensing the growing tension, Jesus quietly withdrew. While the crowd's excitement mounted, he slipped away to the mountainside, alone. His mission could not be dictated by human desire. His purpose was not to seize power but to surrender it, not to sit on a throne of earth but to carry a cross of shame that would become the doorway to eternal life. The disciples watched him go, confusion and unease stirring in their hearts. They still didn't fully grasp what he was doing. The miracle had been incredible, but the meaning behind it, that was something they struggled to understand. Later, when the crowd found him again, their stomachs full but their souls still searching, Jesus spoke words that cut to the heart of the matter. You are looking for me, he told them, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. The people shifted uncomfortably. Bread had filled their bellies, but his words pierced their souls. He was speaking of something deeper, something beyond their immediate needs. I am the bread of life, Jesus declared. His voice carried with authority, yet it was full of compassion. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. It was a revelation. The miracle of bread and fish was not just about feeding bodies, it was a sign pointing to the true source of life. Just as the loaves had been broken to feed the crowd, one day his own body would be broken for the salvation of the world. Some understood, their hearts stirring with faith. But others shook their heads, unwilling to accept a Messiah who offered himself instead of political power. The crowd that had once cheered him as king began to turn away, their expectations unmet. Yet the truth remained, the miracle was not about filling stomachs for a day. It was about showing humanity that in Jesus, God had provided something far greater than bread. He had given himself. The disciples, standing at the edge of it all, held on to his words with trembling hearts. They didn't fully understand yet, but they knew this, they had seen heaven's abundance with their own eyes. They had carried it in their hands. And they had heard from their teacher that he himself was the true bread, the provision for every soul. And though the crowd's excitement faded, the lesson remained, echoing across the ages, God is able to take what seems small and impossible, and turn it into more than enough, not just for the body, but for the soul. The miracle of the loaves and fish was over, but its echoes remained. On that hillside by the Sea of Galilee, thousands had eaten their fill, but the greater truth stretched far beyond bread and fish. The disciples, still carrying the memory of overflowing baskets in their arms, would never forget the lesson, God does not deal in scarcity. His provision is not fragile or fleeting. Where human eyes see impossibility, his hands reveal abundance. In the days and years that followed, they would remember that moment whenever fear whispered that there wasn't enough. Enough food. Enough strength. Enough hope. They would remember how Jesus had looked at a hungry crowd, how he had lifted his eyes to heaven, and how 5 loaves and 2 fish had become a feast. But even more, they would remember his words, "I am the bread of life." It wasn't just about one meal. It was about eternity. About a God who satisfies the deepest hunger of the human soul. A God who doesn't just give us what we need for today, but who offers himself, completely, fully, without limit. The boy with the loaves and fish had given everything he had, though it was small. In the hands of Jesus, that small offering became a miracle that touched thousands. That, too, was a lesson. God doesn't need much, he only asks for our surrender. A little faith. A little trust. A little willingness to place what we have into his hands. And once we do, he takes it, blesses it, multiplies it, and uses it in ways we could never imagine. The crowd had wanted a king who would overthrow Rome. But Jesus had revealed a king who would conquer something far greater, the hunger of the human heart, the emptiness of the soul, the shadow of sin and death. The bread that day filled stomachs, but the bread of life, broken on a cross, risen from the grave, would fill eternity. The disciples would face storms, persecution, and even death for following him. Yet each time they wondered if they had enough strength, enough courage, enough faith, they would remember that hillside. They would remember that in his hands, not enough always became more than enough. And for those who read this story centuries later, the message still stands. When life feels empty, when what we have seems too small, when our needs feel overwhelming, God whispers the same truth, "Bring it to me. Place it in my hands. Trust me to provide." Because the God who multiplied bread and fish is still the God of abundance today. He is still the bread of life. He is still the one who takes the little we offer and turns it into something greater than we could ever dream. The hillside grew quiet that evening, the crowd slowly dispersing, the sun sinking low over Galilee. But the miracle lived on, in the hearts of the people, in the hands of the disciples, and in the eternal promise of a God who never stops providing. And the lesson was clear, with Jesus, there is always enough.